the best places in America to build wealth by age, of course.
It's Brian Preston, the money guy.
Yeah, Brian, one of the things I love about when we do this show is where show ideas come from, right? So obviously, a lot of times it comes from the audience. Sometimes it comes from something we'll be doing internally, with clients at the wealth management firm. But this one kind of came from a different place. This whole show was born out of something that you would not think a Money Guy show would be born out of.
So, guys, it probably plays out a lot like you think it is around here, is that Bo's office is right next to my office. And when I come in the morning, I suck all productivity out of the room by going in and sitting in one of his chairs, and I tell him ideas. So here's what happened. My daughter is taking a personal finance course, and one of the big topics that she had, and it really was incredible, is the income tax rate by state and how that impacts, as well as the cost of living for rent and other things. And I can still remember the example was San Francisco compared to Portland, Oregon.
Sure.
And I'll get into the details later, but I told Avery, I was like, man, you got to pay attention. This really is an amazing thing on why when you're starting out, you got to pay attention what tax rates and other things, because they really influence. So I was all excited about this idea, and I brought it to Bo. He, of course, pulled out his blade, waited until I turned around, and then stuck me in the back, and then told me this idea was horrible. But he did make it better. I give you a lot of credit. You think like I think, but you make things, I think you bridge the idea into something else. Because he came up with, why don't we do this by age of the best places to live? Because what you're hitting on is different parts of the country have different things. And here's what I didn't realize when we had this conversation, because this was probably a month and a half ago that we had this conversation, was how current events were going to veer into what we're talking about here. Because just in the last 3 days, Joe Rogan has announced he's moving from California to Texas. Yep. You hear Tesla has announced they're going to have a brand new plant, that they're going to be building a Cybertruck in Texas as well. So you start thinking about, wow, there are things going on. And how many articles do we see right now because of what's happened with COVID, that people are working from home, big corporations are announcing, you know what, maybe we're not going to go back to the traditional office space component. We're going to let you work from wherever. I think a lot of people are about to say, well, if I've got a choice, let me start figuring out what's important to me on the decision-making of where I should live for my family.
And what I think about, Brian, is we've never actually sat down and put pen to paper, but we actually worked through this entire exercise ourselves, starting way back in the early 2010s-ish time, figuring out where we wanted to live. Like, where do we want to put the business? Where do we want to put the families? What opportunity to look for? And, even though we didn't have this show pinned at that time, we kind of went through the things that we're going to outline in the show and how you should think about where I live really impacts my financial well-being, both now and over the long term.
Have you ever noticed corporations will have an entire task force that their job is to figure out where they're going to put, and then they start getting the local communities to essentially bid out, give them tax breaks and other things, and they'll take the executive teams and figure out where they want to live. I don't think the average American does that. I think most people live where they live because that is close to where they were born.
Family, yep.
It's close to where they went to college. I don't know that people have done a deep dive, yet I spend the entire show. We have so many episodes talking about training your mind to think a certain way, thinking about all the tactics to building wealth. But one of the most important things is to make sure that you're putting your entire financial empire is rooted in fertile soil.
Yep.
And let me give you a perfect example. I lived in Georgia my entire life. Loved it. Now, there are two things that were going on. Bo, you were starting to reach a point in your career. I knew you needed additional opportunity.
Sure.
Because where we lived in South Atlanta was just not going to be economically feasible it could support me and my family, but future advisors, it wasn't going to be the same. So that was, and then I have a special needs daughter.
Yep.
So that the culmination of those things brought together us starting to do this research. And when I tell people we moved to Nashville after we looked at Naples, Florida, after we looked at Alpharetta, Georgia, after we looked at Boone, North Carolina, Charleston. We have a whole list of all the different cities we went through and actually pulled up the data points. People look at me like I have a third eye on my head. And I'm like, no, this was how important this was. So I want to encourage you to think about where you live. I also have a former neighbor who's now back in Chicago. He says his biggest turning point in his career was when he was just a print salesman in Chicago. barely. You remember these guys used to
yeah.
come door to door when we were down in South Atlanta and trying to sell. That's a dismal way to make a living. He took a flyer chance and started doing sales out in California for a technology company. Changed his entire life.
Yep.
I mean, he's back in Chicago now, lived in Tennessee for a while. We have clients.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting, Brian, is like, when we were talking about this on Avery's Personal Finance, it was a lot of focus on early part of your career. Where do I decide I want to start my career? But this actually permeates through all the different stages of life, because what you're about to say is we have clients right now that are either at retirement, at first retirement, or beginning to think about retirement that are starting this process right now, figuring, okay, this is where I've lived for my whole life. How do I make the choice of where I want to retire, where I want to move to, what adjustments I want to make? And so we're seeing it very practically right now in the lives of real human beings.
So don't take for granted where you live, because it does have a huge impact. I will tell you, moving to Nashville, we moved here for all those things on that list.
Yep.
What we didn't know, Bo, is that when we moved here, we were going to have access to more creative types.
Absolutely.
We were going to have access to people who knew how to work video, who could do video editing, who could do graphics. The fact that we moved to Nashville has made this business we've quadrupled.
Easily. Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know what the past quadrupled is.
Quintupled is
quintupled.
next.
Okay, but I'm just telling you guys, if you will change your mindset, this thing might grow more fruit than you even could put in your head.
Love it.
So let's go ahead and jump into this. Best state to start working.
Yeah, and so what we've done in each of these decades is we're trying to look at specific states,
Mm-hmm.
like what states are the most conducive for the thing we're looking at, or what states are the least conducive. And so as we walk through this series, we're going to talk about state specific, and we'll kind of give some disclaimers as we go through there.
Well, and you should have questions.
Yep.
I mean, why do people come to the Money Guy shows? Because we're going to help you train your brain on what questions you should be asking. So the first thing you should ask if you're in your 20s is, how far will my money go?
That's basically the biggest question you can ask, because we know, and like anecdotally, we all know this, because if you talk to older folks, they'll say, oh, well, if you live there, well, you have to make this much just to start out. Well, if you live there, it's pretty common. We all know that, but have we ever actually stopped to look at the numbers to say, okay, how much farther does my money go in one part of the country than another part of the country?
So we had FT Daniel get to work, and we said, go find some research. Because think about it. All these publications have, how often do we see these headlines, best city to live in,
Yep.
Best city to retire in. So we knew the data had to be out there. So we just had Daniel go wrangle it up. And here's what he came up with on trying to figure out how far your dollars will go. What's the best 5 states and what's the worst 5 states?
Yeah, so when we look at it, you can see that these are the best 5 states, meaning the value of your dollar will go farther in these states. There's a lower cost of living. You can see Arkansas comes in with a value of $1 is actually worth $1.15. Kentucky is $1.14. Mississippi is $1.16. Alabama is $1.15, and West Virginia is $1.14. So anywhere from 14 to 16% higher than the normal value of a dollar across the country. So these would be states where if you're earning X dollars, it would be more advantageous to work in that state, to live in that state, because the dollars will go farther than if you lived in a different part of the country.
You made the joke in pre-show that this looks like an SEC map.
It's good to
for
be in the
college
SEC,
football,
yeah.
except for West Virginia over there. But it is interesting that definitely dollars go further. But how about where does your dollar go the least amount in the country?
If we're thinking about best places, we need some contrast to worst places, where there are actually parts in the country where a dollar isn't even worth a dollar. If you look at Hawaii, a dollar only is worth about 84 cents. California, 87 cents. New Jersey, 88 cents. New York, 87 cents. And then Maryland, 91 cents. So we're talking about, 10 to 13% discounts the value of a dollar. So if you think about from one state that has a 13% surplus and then another state has a 13% deficit, there could be like a 26% swing there when you look at what your dollar can actually get for you.
I think it's interesting because when we travel to a different part of the world, like if you're going to Europe, you're looking at what is the exchange rate between the dollar and the euro. And that, when you hear about the power of a strong dollar or of a weak dollar, depending upon which side of it is, who would have thought here in America, even though we all use the same currency, there is totally the same thing going on, is that your dollar will go further depending upon where you are within the country. So that leads to, okay, if we know what money will go the furthest, it's also what opportunities are in the area. And the first thing I'm thinking about is if I'm in my 20s, Will I have a job? Will I have a job to make sure I can pay the bills?
And I think especially in this time that we're in right now, specifically some of the things that we've seen recently, it's not a given that we get out of college, we have a degree, and immediately we just jump into the workforce. That hasn't been a lot of folks' experience. So when you are selecting in your 20s, when you're just getting out of college, where you're going to go live, you really need to take into consideration the employment rate to make sure that you can be gainfully employed.
So here's something I don't think a lot of 20-year-olds do. And I want to go ahead, because I come from the wisdom of somebody who's in my late 40s, is that when I took my first job, I just was thinking about, I just want the job, not really thinking about where the job was. But as we have found, like I think a lot of people, when you hear Nashville, you know, of course, everybody who's got a great set of pipes or can play the guitar well, you know they're probably considering moving to Nashville. But most people don't realize, if you want to know who the billionaires are in Nashville, it's all healthcare people. It's all people, because we are a tremendous health hub. So if you are in the medical field, Nashville probably has more opportunities than you might even realize. Absolutely. And you had a great example too.
Yeah, before my wife was staying home, she was a school teacher. Well, one of her co-teachers, his spouse, was studying midwifery, right? So she was going to school here and she wanted to be a midwife. Well, there actually weren't a ton of employment opportunities here. So they knew as soon as she finished her degree, they were going to have to move to some other part of the country just because that specialty wasn't available here. If you are someone who's practicing or going to school for a specialized vocation, it would really serve you well to know what parts of the country that vocation is in high demand so that you can make sure you secure employment there.
So we did, once again, we employed the services of FTE Daniel, and we said, Daniel, I'm sure U.S. News or some publication has come up with the best states to find a job. Here's what he came up with. And this is, like I said, U.S. News. But what did they use them? Because this was a little unique when I saw this visually. I mean, because it's kind of the middle to left side of the country. And then is that Minnesota up there at the top? So I was like, man, somebody likes either dryness or coldness. I don't see anything in the South down there. So what did U.S. News use as their criteria?
Yeah, so they used unemployment rate, labor force participation, and the change in unemployment between 2014 and 2017. So the data is a little older now. But what they found is that Idaho, Utah, Colorado, Minnesota, and Hawaii are the best states to find a job. So if you're strictly trying to figure out, okay, where can I go to become employed, those 5 states are probably going to be at the top of the list.
And you don't have to, I mean, because we all know cities also come into play on this. So, fast-growing cities that have lots of connections with universities and other things, as well as Fortune 500 businesses, you're going to have more opportunities. But this is a great head start just to kind of know what to look at. And that leads to, and I think this one really plays into, what's the quality of life like in the area you're trying to live in?
Yeah, so the first two were very qualitative in nature. Okay, how much will I make or how far will my money go? And then what are the opportunities in the area? Will I be able to find a job? Well, those are quantitative. This one is the more qualitative one, and it actually matters. We can't tell you how many times we'll see someone who graduates from college, they go and get that dream job they wanted, and they find they're in an area that they just can't stand. They got to drive 2 hours every day to work, and it's hustle and bustle. You really want to make sure you understand what is the quality of life in the place that I'm going to be living.
Now, I was a little, because once again, older, a little more knowledge and wisdom. You look back on your 20s, you go, what did I do with all my time? Because when you get in your 30s, you get in that messy middle, especially if you're having children. You know, there's lots of things going on that you just don't have much time. But fortunately, when you first come out of college, you're going to look back at those years in your 20s. You might as well make sure that you have a great quality of life to build those memories. So that's why we talk about number of universities in the area. Because you know the reason we said number of universities in the area is because when you have colleges, that means you have probably sports. Mm-hmm. You have performing arts. You have, plays. You have people playing instruments. That's one of my favorite things at UGA. And this makes me sound really nerdy, but I love watching live music, was I would get the list of all the master's programs of cello players, all the people, and I'd go around. It wasn't that hard. From the business school, you could walk, and if you had the calendar, you could go watch people that play, in these little mini concerts.
Known you for a long time. You buried that league. Never knew that you did that.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, matter of fact, it was part of a extracurricular activities you could do for music appreciation bonus points. I think I got 100 in that class because went to so many concerts because I just loved it. It was incredible. But that is something. Number of universities in the areas gives you lots of opportunities for free stuff.
That's what I was going to say. The other thing you got to think about is what parks or amenities are available in that area, because we all know when we're in our 20s, when we're just starting out, we don't have a lot of resources. So it might be hard to go to the expensive plays or do the expensive things. But if there are free things like universities, like parks, like greenways, where we can go fill our time without spending our money, that's a great thing to think about.
And then restaurants and entertainment venues.
Now we're spending some money.
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, because I know it's free, but you do want to go out to eat. You want to spend time with friends. Look, I think that's one of the things when we go through, now, being part of this pandemic, is I think we're realizing how powerful it is to be able to go out with your friends and break bread and just enjoy a good meal. Yep. So I think I know a lot of restaurants and hospitality are hurting, but I think a lot of people are going to want to come back to that as soon as they safely can.
And then if you are going to take a job in a more remote area, one of the things you really ought to think about is, okay, what is my proximity to a major city if I need healthcare or whatever the thing may be? And then what's the proximity to the airport? If you're someone who has to travel a lot for your job, you probably don't want to end up settling somewhere that's 2 hours from the nearest airport. You want to make sure you're taking those sorts of things into consideration.
Well, it's not just for the job. You want to be able to travel just so you enjoy life and build memories. So definitely, I thought that was a great add-in when we added proximity to airport. So that leads to, we told you all the questions to ask, but now you're probably saying, well, what resources can I use to start shopping or looking at this stuff and pulling it together? And here's what we found. So, Bo, share with them what we put up here.
So there's a great cost of living calculator. If you just want to go compare different parts of the country, you can go to bankrate.com/calculator. And there's a great tax resource you can use to look at state income tax by state, and that's just taxformcalculator.com to kind of give you an idea of what are the differentials across the country.
Well, and think about the state income tax. Here's the example. I thought it was so interesting. My daughter's personal finance homework compared Portland, Oregon to San Francisco. Yep. And everybody knows San Francisco is not the cheapest state to live in, but they took a $35,000 starting salary for a person and said, what does the state income tax do? I was shocked to see California is actually somewhat, it's affordable from a state income tax standpoint for a $35,000 income, a lower income like that, versus Portland, Oregon. It was a 5% difference for the individual. That has a huge impact if you think about it.
Absolutely.
So let's move on. That's 20-year-olds. Let's move into something Bo resembles, which is, what is the best state to start a family?
Yeah, the best states to just have the messy middle. I feel so bad saying it because the 30s have been awesome and I'm loving them. It's just different. It's a different decade. I know it's different than the 20s was. I believe it's probably different than the 40s is going to be. And there are just some unique things that you have to be thinking about in your 30s. I know for my wife and I, one of the things that we begin to think about is establishing roots for our family and starting a family. So we think just like in your 20s, there are some questions to ask. In your 30s, there are also some very important questions you need to be asking.
So let's jump right into that. So what are the questions? And the first one, Bo, this is important, especially now with everything we're dealing with, is what are the educational opportunities in the area?
Yeah, so if you are starting a family, one of the things that we thought about is, hey, if we start early, we understand how compounding interest works. We want to go ahead and make sure that we're saving for college for our girls. We want to think about how can we begin to give them a leg up in life and start early, even when they're born, saving for college. Well, one of the things, if you listen to the Money Guy show for any period of time, we love 529 plans. And 529 plans are just investment vehicles you can use to save for college. And they're tax incentivized to do so. But what's really interesting is they're not all created equal. Different states have different 529 plans, and different 529 plans are treated differently depending on what state you live in or what state you're from. So if you are trying to figure out where you're going to live, that's probably something you want to take into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, higher education is going to be important. And by the way, we've done multiple shows on 529s. If you want a deeper dive specifically into 529s, go check out some of those shows. But here's what I wanted. We like using the resource Morningstar every year rates 529 plans. We kind of pay attention to that data. And we had full-time equivalent Daniel pull together the top 529 plans according to Morningstar.
So in 2019, and this is based on lowest fees, quality and appropriate investments, oversight from state and local managers, we found that the top were California, Utah, Illinois, and Virginia, which I thought was really interesting because I know one of the plans we talk about all the time is a New Hampshire plan because it's recent and you can have it at Fidelity. But these tend to be, I know especially like the Utah plan, some of the perennial at the top. Alaska's one that's often there as well. But in 2019, they came up with California, Utah, Illinois, and Virginia.
But here's something I do want to make sure because we go do a deeper dive on this when we did the 529 episode. Some states, many states actually have multiple 529s within their single state. So just pay attention because I know Illinois' Bright Start College Savings Plan is considered one of the best, but they do have some higher fee plans as well. So just make sure if you are looking at this list and you live in one of these states or you're a state that, you're looking for opportunities like Utah, New Hampshire, just make sure you're in the right version of the 529 plan.
So another thing you have to think about, and we have some unique experience here that we lived in Georgia, now we lived in Tennessee. We know that depending on the state that you live in, there are different tax benefits relative to that state. What you may not know is that those tax benefits vary pretty widely.
Yeah. Well, and we have a map here because I thought this because 529s fall into the state that your 529s offered in falls into 3 categories. We've got the ones, Bo, go through these really quick because some of them actually are punitive. And this is a big shock for a lot of people is to find out if you have a 529 that been moved to a different state, they might come after you for the tax benefits.
Yeah, so all the green states, and if you're out there listening on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify, any of those areas, you may want to go to YouTube, make sure you can see this map right now. But all the green states are what are labeled as go anywhere states. And what that means is either there's no state income tax, there's no income tax deduction, or there is a state income tax deduction and you get that, and if you move the asset somewhere else, you won't lose a deduction. Or, and I think there are 7 states that fall into this category, even if you live in a state and you contribute to a different state's 529 plan, you can still get a state tax deduction for that.
I have that list because we pulled that together. It was Arizona, Arkansas, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, and Pennsylvania. I do want to put an asterisk on Arkansas. Arkansas had some crazy complications, so just be careful because let's just leave it at that because I could go a whole deeper. But those 7 states, it is kind of unique the fact that you can actually contribute and then go anywhere but still get a tax benefit.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. So if you heard your state mentioned, you may want to revisit the 529 plan that you're using to make sure you're using one of the best. And then you want to make sure that every year you are claiming it on your taxes because you're just leaving free money there if you're not. Well, then there are the deduct and run states. That means if you live in the state and you contribute to the state's 529 plan, you can get a tax deduction. However, if you move or if you choose to move the assets from that state's 529 plan to another state's 529 plan, they won't recapture that. They won't let you, they won't take away that benefit from you.
So that's why it's deduct and run. You can actually take the tax deduction and then move it to another state if you want to. And that leads to number 3. This is the one that's kind of the shock and awe. I think a lot of people don't realize. These are what's called recapture states, the recapture red states. These, and Georgia, by the way, is one of them, is if you took a tax deduction on your state income tax return. We lived in Georgia, took state tax deductions for many years on my kids. If I move those 529 assets to another state, they'll come after you for taking those tax deductions and moving the assets.
That's exactly right. So for us, the planning opportunity was leave the Georgia plan at Georgia, and then we got to Tennessee. It's a go anywhere state. There's no state income tax deduction. We could open up 529s for any 529 in the country.
So that's 529. And I realize it used to be 529s were only higher education. Now you can use 529s not only for higher education, you can use them for trade schools. Now you can, if your state has adopted it. Now don't just assume every state has adopted, but if it has, the tax law now allows K through 12 private education to be paid for from your 529 as well. So these things have gotten better over the years. ABLE transfers. If you have a special needs child, you can even move 529s to ABLE accounts. That's another great benefit. But that leads to the next educational opportunity is, what are the best states for that K through 12 primary education?
That's right. Again, we asked full-time equivalent Daniel to go pull some information. He pulled this from U.S. News, and what they found is that there are a handful of states based on college readiness, high school graduation rate, test scores, and preschool enrollment, which I thought was interesting, and you kind of enlightened me on why that was one. Where are the best states for childhood education? And what's interesting when you look at this map It seems to be highly concentrated up in the Northeast. It's Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Massachusetts.
So here's what I saw when I looked at this. Education typically follows the social economics of the area. Because if you look at all the Northeast, these are higher income parts of the country. So, of course, the education, young K through 12 education is good. I think if we looked at this map from what are some of the poorer states, you'll see the education struggles a little bit more. And I've even seen that with Williamson County. You know, we live in this community. It's one of the wealthier communities in the country. Everybody really brags about how great the public school system is here. We saw it through the pandemic. They had struggles like everywhere else. And it really highlighted, I think, the reason Williamson County does so well is that social economics matter for education. So pay attention to these type of things, and I think it definitely has an impact.
That's a great point. And again, if you're not someone who listens to this show live, we do it live. If you watch on YouTube or Facebook, there's a live chat that's rolling. One of the things that I keep seeing people drop in, and this is a great disclaimer, we're focusing on state level. Obviously, this stuff varies very much city to city or county to county. Like, for example, we know that in Williamson County, it's a really strong, really healthy public school system, but you could go 2 hours away in a different part of Tennessee, and it's not that case. So just recognize, just because these are the 5 best states for early childhood education, it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't cities in other states that are also fantastic as well.
By the way, when I saw this map, I was like, wow, did the guy who put this together, a girl who put this together for U.S. News, they live in the Northeast? But I think this is such an important thing to consider. When we were looking at relocating, Bo, I had a unique situation. I had a special needs child that needed a specialized private learning experience for autism, but then I also needed a great public school system. And sometimes those two things don't go together. Like in the city of Atlanta, they have some private schools that are great for special needs, but there was a lot of struggles in the public education system if we were relocated to Atlanta. So that's why this stuff is so helpful. If you take this into consideration, what are your unique needs? Because education definitely drives a lot of things. Your property values, even if you don't have kids, you will be very appreciative if there's a good school system in your community for property values.
But in our 30s, it's not all about education. There are also some other questions we need to think. So educational opportunities is a great one. The next question that we need to ask ourselves is, what are the local property and state income taxes in my state? Because that's going to matter.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely plays in, and we even have a map. And by the way, I come from a tax preparation background. When you see the no income tax states, what's great is that they're all over the place. So there is some diversification across geography of where you actually could live in a state that has 0 state income taxes.
Now, one thing I love that Full-Time Equivalent Daniel did on this is not only did he list all the states where there's no income tax, he actually did an overlay showing what a dollar will do for you in that state. So not only is there no income tax, you can kind of see by state how valuable a dollar is. And so the 9 states listed are New Hampshire, Alaska, Washington, Florida, Nevada, Texas, Wyoming, Tennessee, and South Dakota. I actually read those from the lowest dollar value to the highest dollar value. So I'll do it again. New Hampshire, Alaska, Washington, Florida, Nevada, Texas, Wyoming, Tennessee, South Dakota. No income tax, but obviously how far your dollars will go and how valuable that benefit is varies very much from state to state.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Florida is essentially the value of a dollar. Because instead of Florida is $1 is worth $1. So I thought that was kind of interesting when you looked at all the data. The other big shocker here was Alaska. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised to see Alaska is actually a higher cost of living type area at 95 cents instead of $1. But that does lead to, because we talk about education being so important, but here's the thing I think that was the biggest sticker shock moment I had when we moved to Tennessee is how affordable is housing. That is definitely something you're going to take a consideration in.
That's one of the things that we hear most often from our Money Guy family. Hey, I see what you guys talk about with the 25%, for how much mortgage I can afford, and I see all the affordability stuff, but I live in X city, and being able to buy a house at that level is just impossible. It just doesn't exist. How much housing costs, how much that basic need of shelter costs is going to have a huge impact on what you're able to do with your finances throughout your working career.
And I think it's because we're doing this on a state level, but you said it earlier, Bo. cities matter too,
Yep.
because I think when we were looking, and we knew what we were getting into, but when we look coming from Georgia to Tennessee, or Nashville specifically, housing's expensive
Yep.
here in the Southeast. Now, everybody in California thinks our houses still cost a
it's
nickel,
cheap, yeah.
but I will tell you, if you already live in the South, you're going to come to Nashville and you're like, wow, housing's kind of an expensive thing here. Meanwhile, everybody coming from the coast, New York, California, they think our houses are still a nickel.
Yep.
But so it's all relative to your mindset. But definitely understand how affordable is housing, because that has a big impact on your purchasing.
And remember, housing is about purchasing homes, but it's also about renting. You need to understand the rental market as well, because I just saw somebody in the comments say, hey, renting isn't a horrible solution, especially if you live in one of those really high cost of living areas. Pay lower rent, save more, build your army of dollar bills. That's not crazy. Just make sure you understand when you do decide to set roots, what the impact of that decision is going to be long term.
Well, think about it. We have clients that have built their wealth renting,
Yep.
but then when they've now decided to kind of take a step back or move to a different part of even the same state, they now are setting roots in purchasing where it's a little more affordable to do it. It's
exactly
all
right.
part of the decision-making process. So we wanted to share some resources now, kind of bring this all together. Here's the first thing. 529s in schools. Go to greatschools.org.
Great. Yep.
Taxes, this one's very powerful. Daniel's very proud of that Kiplinger link that he has there. And then housing and real estate, of course, Zillow, apartments if you're a renter. Those things come in handy to kind of see what's going on in your general area. So make use of those resources.
Love it.
So now let's talk about, this resembles me. We just moved from Bo, who's in his 30s, to myself in my 40s. These are the best states to build wealth. Now, here's what I think is interesting when you're in your 40s. Hopefully at this point you've gotten traction in your career. You're past the messy middle of the fact that in your 30s, in your 20s you're definitely broke. In your 30s you're struggling. You're not broke necessarily from an income standpoint.
You're becoming less broke.
But you have so many things pulling at, the house purchases, the kiddos. It's only in your 40s is the first time in my life that I've actually felt like, man, I've made it through a lot of the struggles. And I think that this is the point why we wanted to focus on what questions should you ask if you are in this 40 stage. And the first thing I put on here is, what does the quality of life look like for you?
Now, I think it's so interesting. If you're watching one of our other segments, or you've been watching from the beginning, quality of life was one of the last things we thought about in our 20s because there were some other things that mattered. In our 40s, this kind of bumps up to the first question you ought to ask. Is there a reason that we did that? Is there a reason why it matters more in your 40s?
Well, I think it's exactly kind of what I've alluded to. You have a little bit more capacity, a little more flexibility, a little margin to spend on these things without jeopardizing your long-term financial success. Remember that promise I made my wife. If we will just really kind of that whole give a little bit of today for a great big beautiful tomorrow. I made that promise to my wife in our 20s and 30s with the promise that when we hit our 40s, we'll take our foot off the gas a little bit just so we can start enjoying life. This is the time, if you've made the right decisions in your 20s and 30s, that you can get some of the dividends from it.
Another thing that you and I have talked about a lot, Brian, is that your kids are only in the house for so long, right? We only give them for the first 18, 20 years of their life until they go out and try, become adults. Well, one of the things in the 40s, those are sort of the formative years for most folks when your kids are at that place where you can really start pouring into them and providing opportunities. And hopefully, if you live in like a decent spot, they're not going to want to leave and be gone forever. They may want to come back to the city or surrounding area that they were raised in, right?
That's exactly right. So that's why I think it is important to understand, because I had this realization. I mean, when my daughter was 10 years old, I woke up one day and I go, oh my gosh, my daughter, there's no way she's ever coming back here once she graduates high school, because when we were living on South Atlanta, it just wasn't the same type of opportunity. That definitely played into my decision making. And I think but remember, what we are talking about here is in your 40s, this is a wealth building part of your life. I mean, you're probably reaching some of your peak earning years in your late 40s. So we also want to know, what are these state income taxes in the area?
So again, we showed this slide earlier. It's again worth noting. Here are the different states that are no income tax, listed by how valuable your dollar is in those states. Some of the ones worth noting: South Dakota, no state income tax, and your dollar's worth $1.13. Tennessee, it's no coincidence, no state income tax. Your dollar's actually worth $1.11 here. So as you're in your 40s, thinking about, if I'm in my peak earning years, two things really ought to ring true. how do I minimize my tax bill and how do I stretch my dollar as far as possible?
So that leads to, here's the next thing. I think that there's a point when you reach your 40s, you're starting to make more money. You could potentially outgrow your community.
Yep.
I feel like I didn't even realize it at the time, but I kind of hit this where I was in South Atlanta in Georgia. And the fact that, I've told this to neighbors and friends when we're talking, once you start making a really good income, you're probably pretty specialized.
Yep.
Your opportunities, just like if you were in a community making a good income, if you lose your job, you're probably going to have to move out of state to find a similar opportunity. Well, it might be the same thing to get to that position.
Yep.
You have to look and say, what specialized things are in what parts of the country that I can actually benefit from?
Yeah, the question that we listed was how many high income opportunities or how many specialized opportunities exist in the area?
Because, and here's what, go see how many Fortune 500 companies are in different parts. And we'll talk about that under resources in a minute. But that is how many, think about like Tesla moving some operations and building a Cybertruck in Austin. Yep. Austin already is a great place from a quality of life standpoint, a lot of opportunities. And here they are, they're about to have now a Tesla plant. Let's go create even more opportunities.
Absolutely.
And here's what thing, geography is not fair. You will see a lot of the cities where opportunity is, it gets bunched up. And you're going to notice, and when you look at where is wealth, it's not like it's geographically spread in this nice little spread out area. No, it's all bunched up in certain areas. So you need to look at your life and say, if this is where if I want to be top of the food chain in this career, is there a part of the country that actually you might have to move to be there?
So one of the things that we asked FTE Daniel to do is like, okay, how can we quantify this? How can we show this? We said, okay, well, let's look at the wealthiest states in the country and let's base it on just median household income. So if we're thinking like high income jobs, where are the on average highest income jobs? But we said that's not a perfect representation by itself because not only do we need to look at where the median income is high, but how valuable is your dollar there. So we've listed the states. These are the 10. It's the state of Washington, Virginia, California, Alaska, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Hawaii, New Jersey, and Maryland are the 10 states with the highest median household income. But what you can see is just because you make more income in those areas doesn't necessarily mean that your dollar is going as far as you think it might be going.
Well, I think we're a perfect example here in Nashville. That's why we have so many of my neighbors are from Chicago, California, New York. I mean, they're all coming to Nashville because when they see that their property taxes on the same value house, meaning if you take the fair market value of the house, what costs $5,000 in Williamson County, where we live, will be $35,000 in property taxes in Chicago. Because I know because I have people texting me when they write these checks. And you come here and you're like, holy cow. So I'm just telling you is exactly what Bo said. Is what is the taxation? What's the impact? Because it's not always income taxes. It's also the property taxes. It's the sales taxes of the areas. Understand, and we know we listed this by state. A lot of this is going to be very city specific as well, but it is definitely something you need to take into account.
So one of the things that we try to really help our clients with who do this all the time is say, hey, I just got a job offer in Palo Alto, or I've been offered to move somewhere across the country, and man, it sounds really good because this is my salary now, and my salary, they're offering me this. One of the things we do is we actually use that cost of living calculator, say, okay, yeah, you may be making $20,000 more, but the cost of living is going to be 30% more, so it actually doesn't compensate for that. So if you are someone thinking about changing jobs, changing states, changing circumstances, make sure you understand the full implications of what those changes are.
So let's flip the script and talk about the resources to kind of bring all this together. The first thing, we did focus on quality of life, and I know this sounds kind of common sense, but it's something you could use as a tool. Yelp, Open Table, let's go see how many restaurants or other things like that, because we all love to break bread when that's part of the daily life. State income taxes. This is actually, I got this link from my daughter's personal finance. I thought it was so good. You can go and compare each one of the states and the income taxes within those states so you can know where you are. And then last one we put on here is what's the income per capita in the Fortune 500 companies. You can use Wikipedia, and then I'll let you Statista.
So Statista.
So so those are resources you can go check out to make sure you understand how far your money will go, as well as what's the opportunities that you can play off of. That leads to This is something I'm quickly approaching. By the way, I don't plan on retiring. So just because I'm getting older, don't think that this means it.
50 didn't mean he was going to retire.
No, I think I'm in that sweet spot that you save, you build. It creates more opportunities, more flexibility, so you can even do more crazy things for the Money Guy Show. Because this is the best states to retire or build more flexibility and margin into your life. And that's what I'm going to do. So here's the questions we talked about you should ask if you are 50s plus. The first thing is, are there any incentives for living there? Because a lot of states will have retirement income exclusions. They'll have some benefits as you reach a certain age on your property taxes. Take that stuff into account.
Now, this is one I often don't try to give you too much credit for being a CPA. But it is pretty cool that you're a CPA. And I remember one of the things that we did all kinds of studying, taxation, all that kind of stuff when I was coming through school. But when I first started working for you in Georgia, in the state of Georgia, I was amazed when we started reviewing client tax returns on some of our retired clients in Georgia. And I was like, Brian, I don't understand. I'm doing this projection, but it's not coming out right. I'm coming up that they should pay way more taxes than they're paying. What's going on there?
Yeah. Well, that's what we have. A lot of Georgia has made it. They have made a decision. There's several things, and you want to know how policy impacts what is going on in your state. Georgia made two strong decisions probably about 15 years ago. They wanted a lot of movies to be made there.
Right.
So they are like the Hollywood of the South because they have a tremendous tax credit for movies. But they also decided they didn't want Florida to get all the people moving from, who are retiring, because it's not uncommon. You see a lot of people retire down to Florida. Georgia's like, we'd like to have some of those people because, retirees are great. They usually have steady income streams because they have pensions, they have Social Security, as well as they don't have kids that go to school anymore, and they spend money. So they're like, we got to get these people in. So Georgia saw that, and they put a retirement income exclusion where they don't tax. I think it's up to $65,000. It might even be more because it was going up per person. They were very good on property taxes where you didn't pay the education part once you reached a certain age. So all these things, and a lot of the other states have gotten in on this game. So pay attention to, are the states trying to incentivize older people to move back in there?
So in addition to retiree income benefits, you wanted to ask, are there any state income tax and property tax exclusions? Just what you said, things we ought to be aware of. So again, FTE Daniel coming through hard for us. According to Kempletcher, these are the most tax-friendly states, and this is based on state income tax, property tax, sales tax, estate tax, and retiree income exclusions. And I'll just list these states. And again, what Daniel did is, if you're not looking at the screen, he overlaid how far your dollar will go in these states so you kind of get an idea of how it changes across the country. The states are Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Nevada, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. A lot of the southeastern states look like there's probably a pretty good place to age.
Well, and I didn't want to go through each one of these, but I did pull the top three because I thought because these are variables you would want to pull for yourself. All three, like you look at South Dakota, state income tax, none. Tennessee, none.
Yep.
Wyoming, none. So you can see how that checked off while these are in the top three. If you look at the average property taxes, South Dakota was $1,388 for every $100,000 of assessed value.
Wow.
Tennessee was $768. Remember how I was talking about how everybody thinks everything's a nickel here? Wyoming was $635, even cheaper, so that definitely had a big play. The state income, the sales tax within states, look at South Dakota, was 6.4. Tennessee is a little higher, 9.47. Wyoming is 5.32. And then here's a big one for also retirees. Is your state, and this sounds morbid, is it a good place to die?
Yeah.
Because a lot of you guys, as you build wealth, you're worried about what are the estate taxes for, because we know, I've dealt with it with people who live in Illinois. I'm trying to think of all the different states that you realize, even though the federal tax exemption has gotten so high that federal income tax, estate taxes are not a big deal, a lot of your states do still want to tax you when you die. And they also, a lot of you will need to set up trust, because it's not even a good state to avoid, because probate taxes states on value. So all this stuff plays into it. You'll notice every one of these top three, South Dakota, Tennessee, Wyoming, there's no estate or inheritance tax on any of those states that made it into the list.
And we all know that, as we age, why does this matter? Why is this important? Because once we go from using our back and our hands and our brains to provide for our well-being, we have to count on that army of dollar bills to do so. Well, if you're counting on your army of dollar bills, you want to stretch it as far as possible. That's why we do see a lot of our clients who have lived maybe in some of those very high cost of living areas. This has become first and foremost for them figuring out where am I going to retire to so that I can stretch my army of dollar bills as far and as long as possible.
And that leads to, because those are all very analytical things. Let's talk about some of the emotional stuff or quality of life. I think, and I shared this earlier with, I think it was in the 40s, but definitely in the 50s as well, is I woke up when my daughter was 10 years old and realized, oh my gosh, I'm over halfway of having my daughter in my house. That's so scary that she's going to go away to college. Probably this is my own mom's revenge on me, is because she always talks about I was so independent as a kid. I graduated and then I disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, I said, and I don't want, but I think that happens. You're so proud of your successful kids, but sometimes that success and independence means they're probably not coming around as much as they once were. And as a parent, that makes you really sad. So I always think about, where can I live that might have opportunities for my children as well as grandkids, just because just maybe selfishly, the city I live in is so cool and has so many opportunities. Maybe the kids and the grandkids live nearby or live in 15, 20 minutes away that I actually get to see them.
Yep.
And I know that is probably such an emotional thing. Maybe that's a Southern thing, because I don't know if but I think most of us selfishly want our family to live as close as possible. So think about what opportunities are you, if you're in your 30s, 40s, and even 50s, do you need to move now to make sure that your kids and grandkids have those opportunities? You could be the patriarch that makes that decision. And then hopefully, it is a little bit of luck and prayer that goes into it, but you could do some planning to kind of nudge the needle in a certain direction.
Well, and I think a lot of times we see folks who think through this, but don't think all the way through it. I have a very dear friend. He was very successful in the corporate world, and his and his wife's retirement plan was they were going to build a house on Maui. They were going to move out to Hawaii, live out in Hawaii, and it finally came time for them to retire, and they said, you know what, if we do this,
we'll never see
we're never going to see our kids. We're never going to see our grandkids. They won't be able to come out here. They'll have ball games and calendars and all this stuff. So they made the choice not to do that. Even though that was their retirement plan, this qualitative purpose, this qualitative fact was very real for them. So they made the choice to live closer so they could actually have time with their grandkids.
So that's a very important one. I mean, how often when we're talking about hiring employees, if we're relocating them here, we go, where are the parents?
Yeah.
Because they're going to want to see grandkids. They're going to want to move because they're going to want to be around the grandkids. So that stuff comes into play. And that leads to the last thing, and this is a common trend, is what universities and colleges are in the area. Because when you retire, guys, you kind of flip the script. You're back to having a little extra time. What's funny is I'm in an entrepreneur group, Bo, and I can tell all the guys I'm in the group that own businesses that have their kids out of the house or older, because they have all kind of things to do. Hey, why don't we get a group of guys together on a Tuesday night to grill out meat? And I'm like, guys, I'm kind of knee deep and still working on the kids. So I think that this is why university and colleges in retirement is, because if you want to go catch a baseball game on a Tuesday, you can do it much easier. If you want to, like I was talking about earlier, if you want to go watch live music, it's going to be easier. And cost of living, there's usually lots of restaurants that cater towards students that don't have a lot of resources. So even the finer dining, like if you go to Athens, Georgia.
Oh, you could eat like a king.
Oh my gosh. Guys, whenever I travel back to Athens, Georgia, my wife and I go to the nicest restaurants, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's so cheap here compared to like Nashville or Atlanta or other cities, because college towns are typically lower cost of living. So you might want to, and plus when you're older, you have enough time. If you want to go audit some classes, a lot of colleges and universities will allow retirees to come in and essentially pay very low cost, if not even free, to come just audit a class.
And look, just because you're retiring from one thing or you're changing from one doesn't mean that you're not still a lifelong learner. Perhaps having access to those college universities, you might want to start taking some classes, get a new degree, pursue a new vocation, not because you have to, just because you get to. So that's kind of a cool thing to have in your back pocket.
So let's kind of close this out with some resources. Of course, we've mentioned Kiplinger's has a great resource out there. Daniel, I'm hoping that when we put this out on moneyguy.com, we'll actually put some links to it so that people, if you're listening, as Bo mentioned, Spotify, iTunes, some of the stuff where you can't see links, you can at least go to our website, moneyguy.com, and we'll share those resources with you. State income taxes. And then, man, we just talked about it, universities.
Yep.
So, guys, all of this, do you see how so much of our content is spent training your brain to think about what you want, where you want to be. Begin with the end in mind.
Finances, we have found, is not strictly dollars and cents. There's a lot more that goes into it than that. Dollars and cents plays a big part in it, and you have to make decisions that factor into that. But sometimes they are very small decisions, just like choosing the state that I start working in, the state that I start a family in, the state that I grow a family in, the state that I retire to, that can have long-term financial impacts that you don't even realize.
Well, I think that this is one of those, it's a big decision. It's such a big decision that a lot of us just kind of plan ourselves where we are because that's the easiest.
Yep.
Status quo is easier. But I'm telling you, this big decision might be what drives you to the next level. I mean, think about the fact Elon Musk, South African, is now American. Do you think Tesla and SpaceX would occur if he had not moved to California?
Certainly not the way that they have.
That's why I got to tell you, it's just like I mentioned, Money Guy Show would not be the same. We'd still be doing a podcast, which was great. And but we would never have been able to transition from podcast to YouTube without access to all the creatives and video editors and everything else that we have just stumbled across in our life. Now, look, you can outsource a lot of this stuff now much easier.
Sure.
But how often do we find, and you talk about this, Michael Hyatt down the hall. By the way, Michael Hyatt's down the hall.
Right.
What a resource there is. He talks about motivation and other things. You stumble across these people at lunch.
Yep.
So I'm just telling you, those type of things, those happenings will kind of energize you and create opportunities you have not even woken up parts of your brain to recognize. So think about these things. If anything, even if you don't move, hopefully some of this has spurred enough thought that you figure out, well, if this isn't the time, is it in retirement? Is this, there's all kind of opportunities for you to figure out, how do I internalize this and make sure I'm utilizing it so I can make my money go that much further.
If you haven't had a chance to go to our website, go to moneyguy.com, check out our resource page. We have deliverables out there that you can download for free. You can use them, you can share them, you can send them out. We want to help you take your finances to the next level every chance that we can.
Moneyguy.com. Make sure you subscribe, ring the bell. Money Guy team, out.